in education. Kevin McDonough will be introducing our speaker, David Blacker, in a minute. But before we began, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Centre. We are a multi-institutional provincial research centre of excellence, and our mission is to advance scholarship on teaching and learning processes and develop new pedagogical tools and practices. So I'm very excited to hear our speaker today, and I'll turn things over now to our member Kevin McDonough, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Dave. Like David Waddington, I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, who's an old friend of mine and partner in crime from graduate school days at the University of Illinois. And every time I'm able to hear him speak about his work, I always find it interesting and fascinating. He's really, I think, one of the most original thinkers out there, whether in philosophy of education or beyond. So I'll just say very quickly a few words about David in case you're not familiar with his work. He specializes in philosophy of education, and his appointment currently is at the University of Delaware, where he holds appointments in the School of Education and the Legal Studies program. He previously held appointments at Illinois State University and Teachers College, Columbia University, New York. His writing explores a wide range of issues in education and philosophy. He's the author of 5 books. I think I might just say a couple of words about 2 of them, his 2 most recent books, because I think they have an interesting connection with the talk that you're about to hear today. David's second most recent book is called The Falling Rate of Learning and the Neoliberal Endgame, published by Zero Books. And in that book, Blacker unflinchingly examines the ways in which neoliberalism is driven by a logic of what he calls eliminationism. Specifically, most generally, the elimination of the conditions by which education institutions and other institutions are able to support and promote and sustain conditions of educational meaning-making and of ultimately enabling students to live meaningful lives. That's a big claim, and his defense of it is interesting. It's obviously a bleak conclusion, and part of the point of that is that David wanted to confront, I think, as honestly as possible, the ways in which current educational institutions are emptying out the conditions of meaning in education. And of course that's important for education, where meaning is absolutely basic. In his most recent book, What's Left of the World, David tried to, I think, adopt a more, if I could say, instead of an eliminationist stance, a more constructivist stance or productivist stance, and he explored possibilities for which education, identity, and meaning-making might still be available in a neoliberal world. And as I see it, in any case, from our conversations about the paper he's about to give, he's exploring one intriguing avenue that might develop and expand on some of those ideas. So I'm going to turn it over to David and welcome him to McGill and to the CSLP. David.
All right. Okay. Am I in frame?
Perfect.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you, David, Waddington, and Kevin, and thanks to McGill and Concordia for having me. I appreciate it. Interesting time to be traveling internationally here, but worked well so far. I'm going to get right to it because I have a fair amount to talk about. So, more is claimed for psychedelics than for other drugs. They're said to be capable of providing insights that are wrenching, life-altering, perspective-shifting, and laden with spiritual meaning. These characterizations seem to imply an educational claim. that one has learned something as a result of them. While one may learn something from having a good time, there's clearly something more specific being communicated here. Something more weighty and durable is meant. Roland Griffiths and colleagues at Johns Hopkins University's Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research have in multiple studies established the possibility that psychedelic experiences can be of deep significance to patients with trauma. In the clinical setting, subjects reported their encounter with psilocybin to be among the, quote, 5 most personally meaningful and among the 5 most spiritually significant experiences of their lives. Comparable to the birth of a child, for example. And that astonishingly, and this is what really kind of propelled me into this area in some ways, the psilocybin encounter significantly and durably reduced death anxiety among terminal cancer patients, all of which implies that something very powerful has been learned. When anything at all, substance or not, affects something as basic as death anxiety, it is time for everyone to sit up and pay attention. This demonstrable pedagogical power accords, I think, with the customary veneration of entheogens in indigenous contexts as, quote, plant teachers and the like. So, given the burgeoning scientific inquiry, it's prudent to respect a salutary academic division of labor in this multidisciplinary area where nobody should make health-related claims for psychedelics outside medical research. So, I'm certainly not going to do anything approaching that. So long as it remains recognized that there are areas outside the medical domain that are worthy of serious research as well. Good fences make good neighbors. Yet also it must be recognized in the manner of the shamanic tradition that healing and teaching are ultimately not always neatly separable. It could well be that these substances present learning opportunities for the unwell and the well alike. As groundbreaking and well-meaning as they are, and I have no doubt of this, it is important not to cede psychedelia's emergent pedagogical possibilities only to the clinicians. Viewing them exclusively within the frame of cures for specific ailments may have the effect of artificially narrowing their possibilities. As their ancient and global pedigree attests, the utility of entheogens is surely much farther ranging than this. So education is one such area that may be conceived outside the frame of both medicine and recreation without diminishing either. It therefore seems worthwhile to try to identify what might be specifically educative in these experiences. Even as we acknowledge that sharp delineations seem unlikely, what might the hallmarks be of a truly educational experience with psychedelics, one irreducible to the terms of the medical therapeutic model? In their trip reports, experiencers often claim that these experiences are to be set apart because something more profound than a good time is taking place in them. They claim, in other words, to have learned something important. What are we to make of a claim like this? Toward an answer, I'm going to suggest some conceptual categories for locating the specifically educational component of entheogenic experiences. Okay, so that's the general aim here. So, in Plato's dialogue, Meno, Socrates' eponymous interlocutor likens the state of being jolted out of everydayness to being stung by a torpedo fish, narke, interesting etymology. Literally a numbing drug fish, probably a colorful way of describing a stingray, causing Meno finally to be rid of his conceit to knowledge and thereby rendering him, quote, perplexed, but ready to learn. And here's a quote from the dialogue. Meno, Socrates, I certainly used to hear, even before meeting you, that you never did anything else than exist in a state of perplexity, aporia, yourself, and put others in a state of perplexity. And now you seem to be bewitching me and drugging me and simply subduing me with incantations, so that I come to be full of perplexity. And you seem to me, if it is appropriate to make something of a joke, to be altogether, both in looks and other respects, like a flat torpedo fish of the sea. For indeed, it always makes anyone who approach it grow numb, and you seem to me now to have done that very sort of thing to me, making me numb. Again, Narcan is the root word. For truly, both in soul and in mouth, I am numb and have nothing with which I can answer you. This teacher-induced perplexity is the famous state of mind of Socratic ignorance. which is generated via teacher-student dialogue and illustrates how the removal of a student's conceit to knowledge is one of the removal of a student's conceit to knowledge is one of teaching's greatest tasks. With regard to ignorance, it's not, as it's often thought, the removal of ignorance that is to be most highly prized in teaching, but rather the achieving of it. From the Socratic point of view, the pupil's state of ignorance is more even than one pedagogical accomplishment among others. It supplies a necessary condition for any learning whatsoever. One is close to the inherent novelty of the learning experience when one thinks one already knows. As with Socratic dialogue, the destructive precondition for learning, the fostering of the requisite perplexity, may certainly be arrived at through natural means. But under the right conditions, it seems able to be chemically induced as well. As the numbing drugfish himself, a devoted and enthusiastic participant in the drugged rituals of the Eleusinian mysteries, was undoubtedly personally well aware. One may practice meditation, hypertrophic breathing, fasting, dancing oneself into a trance, drift away in a reverie, be swept up in a work of art or literature, fuse one's identity with a social group, become shocked by a gestalt aha, achieve a feeling of mystic union with God or nature, become swelled by Freud's oceanic feeling, along with other countless states of mind where one is liberated from the default purposive state of mind and into the aporia of which Socrates spoke. These experiences and countless more may catalyze a moment of respite from the usual circuitry of in order tos that characterize most of waking life. In this broad existential sense, there is probably nothing at all ontologically special about psychoactive drugs. From time immemorial, however, they have provided an efficient opportunity, paradoxically, to plan to have an experience of the unplanned, to deliberately and reliably induce those extra-pragmatic states of mind that are otherwise available mostly to those unusually powerful individuals among us, shamans, mystics, prophets, capable of the requisite spiritual discipline. For those of us who are not yet superstars of spirituality, these molecules represent a significant convenience. But as their adoption by traditional cultures indicates, their relative ease of use, including their predictable temporal duration, also renders them potentially more inclusive and therefore capable of informing collective imaginaries and shaping shared lifeways rather than being an elite possession only for a few. In a way, they might be said to represent a democratization of spirituality along the same exact communal lines as a traditional Navajo peyote ceremony, or indeed, as recent archaeochemical research has suggested, the ancient Greek Eleusinian mysteries themselves and early Christian Eucharist, and the latter suspiciously fortified ceremonial wine. So the foregoing suggests that provoking the Socratic aperture of perplexity and aporia might be one sense in which psychedelics can help preface learning experiences. So let's explore further the features of this psychedelic lesson plan. What we're after is a substantive learning experience rather than one as merely entertaining. So not to knock entertainment, it has its place, and fun, of course, can be serious. Play is crucial to child development, comedians are among our most insightful social critics, and the trickster is a universal archetype, just to name a few ludic examples. But many in the psychedelic community are at pains to emphasize a depth dimension to what they've experienced and to draw a distinction between the putative profundity of their journey and the mere oohing and ahhing over the cool visuals and general trippiness. Admittedly, the perceptual circus can be highly diverting. Intense colors, kaleidoscopic patterns, a waviness or a breathing quality to one's perceptual field, lingering tracers when tracking moving objects, a heightened ability to notice a wider than normal range of goings-on around one, a busier than usual buzzing of sounds, etc. And sometimes the fun of these perceptual bedazzlements, or the discomfort if one is alarmed by them, is quite enough, and they often comprise most of what goes on during a trip. Yet many, particularly with higher dosages, would not be satisfied with the conclusion that the perceptual shenanigans were all there was to it. Something central to the experience would be missing if that were it. In their trip reports, People commonly say that they have been educated by them in the sense that as a result they have learned impactful lessons that have made a durable impact on their subsequent lives. Often these can be boiled down to a single key moral insight. For example, don't take yourself so seriously, or be there for your loved ones, or very often large-scale generalizations like everything is love, we are all connected, we must all care for the earth, etc. People are often aware that these sound like inspirational wall poster quotes, which can lead to frustration or amusement that they can do no better at articulating exactly what they have learned. There seems often to be an ineffability about these experiences that eludes full description. There's a frustrating mismatch between the experience itself and the ability to describe it. Certain artists have perhaps done better. One thinks of the fascinating hallucinogen-inspired paintings of Alex Gray. But still, as visionary as these may be, these artworks seem more suggestive than specifically instructive. At least it seems so from a philosophical point that craves more defined answers. Okay, so I'll first approach these experiences phenomenologically, noting how they do in fact initially appear, and refraining from making extrapolating judgments as much as possible. The material for this analysis is found among the copiously available trip reports, literary descriptions, artistic visions, and personal conversation. A phenomenological account would not look too quickly past psychedelics' initial perceptual adumbrations. Although, as an external observer, it would seem easy to take on a spectator's perspective at the parade of perceptual stimuli, as if one were merely watching an especially good light show, the sensory inputs are also accompanied by an obverse sub rosa feeling, one that can register as delightful, or in rare cases terrifying, and provide one with an attitude about what's going on. One is pointedly not a disinterested observer. One is being there in the Heideggerian sense of being fully involved in undergoing the perceptions. This is like the difference between watching a kiss in a movie and actually kissing. In both cases, one knows a kiss is going on, but in only one case is one actually experiencing kissing. So it is not an experience of disembodied or disinterested observation. Despite all the surface shimmer, beneath it all, one is also undergoing the experience in a more holistic sense. It has, for example, mood and emotion attached to it. It makes one feel a certain way. There is also, and I think this is important, a palpable sense of lived temporality, namely that it's best to go with the flow of things. In more pointed terms, a sense that one has to sit back passively and let it happen because one cannot and should not try to control it. One cannot close one's eye and make it stop or snap out of it in any simple sense. Indeed, one of the cardinal rules of psychedelic guides is to counsel patients not to attempt to fight or evade it, and even counterintuitively go toward anything presenting as alarming or frightening. This aspect of the phenomenon seems important. It suggests that what is occurring is a potentially expansive feeling of, as the existentialist would say, the contingency of one's own being in the world. More, the perceptual fluctuations occasion something akin to an inferential psychological process where one starts to see that what one has been taking for granted as perceptual bedrock reality is actually, let us say, more flexible than previously assumed. Again, some find this funhouse aspect exhilarating where others are discomfited by it, and there seems ample room for both attitudes simultaneously and rapidly sequentially within the same trip. But wherever one lies on the pain-pleasure spectrum regarding these feelings, that is, whatever the set of one's mind regarding them, one is reacting to an induced apprehension that things are maybe not as they seem ostensibly, things in general. One gains a highly vivid sense that there's somehow something more out there than meets the everyday eye. We already know this intellectually beforehand. From regular perceptual distortions. The stick looks bent in the water. I could have sworn I heard footsteps outside the tent last night, etc. As with the movie kiss, though, there's a vast difference between knowing something intellectually, for example, I will die someday, versus knowing it in the sense of accepting it as an intimate and comprehensive reality for me. A surgeon who knows all about mortality statistics and has even seen many people die may nonetheless have great difficulty when actually confronted with evidence of her own impending demise, say, when instead of giving the terminal diagnosis to a patient, the tables are turned and she receives it herself. This fuller felt experience of contingency is worlds away from merely apprehending it cognitively. I'll call this phenomenon epistemic loosening. It is an experiential state wherein sensory perceptions alter such that one cannot trust them as one typically does in normal everyday mode. So it's more than just a cognitive assent to a proposition. It also makes one feel a certain way. So one is made to wonder, was this trust, in my senses misplaced all along? What else should I mistrust? And down the epistemic rabbit hole we go. One does not need to go very far, though, to experience epistemic loosening. Even that slight waviness of one's visual field is sufficient to occasion at some level the understanding of perceptual contingency and the bemused skepticism that naturally flows for anyone who is minimally reflective. Psychedelic epistemic loosening seems in this way closely related to the numbing perplexity of the ready-to-learn moment of Socratic ignorance. In both, the conceit to knowledge is to varying degrees troubled. Okay, further. In psychedelic guidance terminology, it is now standard to speak of set and setting in trying to optimize a trip and avoid bad outcomes. Setting has to do with environment, with the environment within which the trip occurs. Is it at home? Is it in a park on a beautiful day? At a funeral? Set has to do with one's mindset going in. Is the incipient trigger worried about something? Is the incipient tripper worried about something depressed, feeling generally pretty good about her life? I would suggest that one's attitude toward this Socratic-like epistemic loosening, if it can be identified in advance, should be considered an important aspect of the set in this context. And there's actually some interesting research, empirical research on this. One disposed to enter that Socratic state of readiness to learn will, I think, tend to have a very different experience than one who's not. This is a ubiquitous theme among psychedelic guides from across the spectrum, from the traditional shamanic to modern therapeutic contexts. It also seems to be settled common sense among psychedelic users. As just mentioned, one needs to have an attitude of openness toward the experience and let it go whither it goes, rather than allowing one's preconceptions to cause it to try to cause one to try to control it. Someone embarking on a high dosage LSD trip, let alone ayahuasca or DMT, with the mindset of being in command of how it will all unfold, is laughable. Just as it would be laughable for one of his interlocutors to try to control an on-form Socratic dialogue. Occasioned by the perceptual wobbles that are among the first things noticed at the onset of a psychedelic experience, this destabilizing epistemic loosening is a key initial clue to locating the educative element that lies within it. Beneath all the surface bells and whistles and akin to Socratic ignorance, it prepares the mind for novelty and so positions it as ready to learn. So, continuing here, dissociative experiences such as epistemic loosening lie on a spectrum. On the extreme end, there are phenomena such as the so-called K-hole of ketamine, an anesthetic with hallucinogenic properties now rendered in clinical settings, that is described as like an out-of-body experience, the K-hole. And at perhaps the farthest dissociative edge are the bizarre happenings found with 5-MeO-DMT, which is derived from the venom of the Sonoran desert toad, not to be confused with like the DMT and ayahuasca. Anyway, where during a relatively short trip of 10 to 15 minutes, subjects undergo what is described as a more or less complete whiteout dissociation from their sense of self, their ego, sometimes blissful, sometimes terrifying, sometimes both, after which they sometimes report returning with a new sense of connection with other people, living organisms, and even nature as a whole. To these extreme experiences, one might add what psychedelic guru Terence McKenna called heroic doses of psilocybin, which is 5 grams dried, and high doses of LSD, and also robust ayahuasca and DMT trips. Here, epistemic loosening would be so euphemistic as to be inaccurate. Users describe it non-pejoratively as more like an epistemic crisis, where the borders of the self are perceived to have dissolved, and the ego at the very least radically reduces its prominence. Some go so far as to use the metaphor of ego death to relate the feel of what is happening during these journeys. And when you read like people's trip reports, they're often sometimes psychonauts, and others are like, well, I want to get that ego death, and it's something to be like celebrated. Anyway, unsurprisingly, this blurring of the boundaries of self and world very commonly give rise to a visceral appreciation of connectedness to that which previously seemed outside and other, for example, nature. When things develop in a positive direction, an ancient paradox ensues. One finds oneself by losing oneself, as is stated by medieval Japanese sage Dogen Zenji, to know oneself is to forget oneself. The diminution of the ego associated with epistemic loosening allows it then to reconnect and integrate with something previously perceived as external. This amazing grace paradox, I once was lost and now I'm found, is a core experience of the world's mystical traditions and is hardly a unique feature of psychedelia. Nonetheless, it does appear that psychedelics can provide a relatively easy entree into what mystical experiences feel like, mysticism for the masses. The common so-called unitive experience, and this is from the empirical literature on what people report. The common unitive experience in psychedelics seems to be built up out of these sentiments of connection, as in we are all one, everything is connected, it's all about love, etc. The altered sense of self appearance in such moments, and it doesn't always last for very long, is a visceral version of what I'll call hypertrophic identification, where one identifies with a more substantial entity like the earth, nature, the cosmos, God, etc. In the history of philosophy, a close analog may be found in certain branches of Stoicism and Epicureanism, like those associated with Lucretius and his famous poem, The Nature of Things, where the idea is that one achieves a kind of immortality and comfort from the terror of death via the contemplative identification with the laws of science and their manifestation in the natural world, also the beauty of them too. In a Platonic or perhaps Pythagorean vein vis-a-vis mathematics, one overcomes the anxieties and imperfections of the sublunary world by participating in mente with that which is itself unchanging. Psychologically, one achieves a release from anxiety in this manner through what Hellenistic philosophers called ataraxia. Spinoza has a version of this as well, where he counsels in his magnum opus, The Ethics, to perceive matters sub specie eternitatis, that is, from the perspective of eternity, the source of the colloquial advice to look at things philosophically. For the Stoics, the royal road to ataraxia is mainly through science and logic. For the Pythagoreans and Platonists, it is mathematics, and for the Spinozans, it is a broader-based geometrical inquiry into first principles, leading to an intellectual love of God. For Christians, this move away from the ego may involve sharply differently into the moral goal of a life emulating Jesus, the so-called imitation of Christ, which Thomas à Kempis, in his influential devotional text, saw as the core of the religion. That book, by the way, is second only to the Bible, apparently, in terms of its distribution in the medieval world. There are, of course, many other strategies generative of this kind of hypertrophic identification, including, one should add, ethical acts of altruism, self-sacrifice, and in extreme cases, martyrdom, representing countless objects with which it is possible to identify. So, most striking for present purposes is that hypertrophic identification seems not to occur sui generis, but rather seems dependent on some pre-existing doxological substrate. In other words, it grafts itself hermeneutically onto a framework of beliefs, the deep mindset already held at some level by the experiencer. I have seen no reports of a psychedelic experience that at one fell swoop inserting into anyone's head an entirely novel worldview. The hypertrophic identification enabled by the epistemic loosening seems instead to work opportunistically with whatever pre-existing ideational material one has lying around. In suggesting this polysemy, I mean to cast doubt on those who take the view that the identification is more determined, namely that it is inherently nature-oriented or peace-loving or some such. You hear this a lot. This undoubtedly occurs, but I do not see it as inevitable. The hypertrophic identification could be in altogether different directions, including much darker ones like human sacrifice, witch hunting, or fascist politics, where a fanatical subject might identify herself with a larger cause of any number of types. And those examples I did not pick at random. They're real ones. Hypertrophic identification is definitely playing with fire. In a way, US President Richard Nixon was right to fear psychedelics as potentially highly destabilizing, and like fire, it can be highly salutary or extremely destructive. It all depends on the nature of the pre-existing doxastic material with which one's identity is to be fused. I see it as a liquidizing agent, like a molten metal that is fluid and amorphous until it is poured into pre-laid molds, the molds being latent systems of belief that can be reanimated by the hypertrophic identification process, that psychedelics can spur. In the terminology of the psychedelic guides, if what we have been discussing so far has to do with philosophical aspects of the set, this attention to latent belief systems as thought molds transitions us into the discussion of deep aspects of setting. Both set and setting, therefore, must be included as conditions for durable learning. In the terms discussed so far, psychedelics can help make one ready to learn by helping to minimize the ego in preparation for hypertrophic identification. But how might this be made a memorable event? What might make it stick? Okay. One hallmark of a worthwhile learning experience is durability. We may forget a great deal, and perhaps we forget most of what we have learned in the long span of life. Against what is commonly thought, how much of that stuff do you even remember? This does not mean that the learning was pointless, however. We might not remember the capital of Moldova, but in studying a wide range of subject matter, we indirectly acquire habits of mind, patterns of thought, and a, quote, illusionary base of symbolic tools, as philosopher of education Harry Brody once termed it. Yet surely there should be at least some shelf life to an alleged learning experience to qualify it authentically as such. Pure effervescence would seem disqualifying. This is why it's difficult to say one has truly learned something from a dream that remains unrecalled and of which one has zero memory. There may be subconscious goings on, of course, and these assuredly control our behavior to a significant degree, but learning as commonly understood implies some element of conscious appropriation. And consciously appropriating something must always have at least some temporal dimension that can allow for at least some period of rumination. One may certainly learn from an experience that lasted a split second. People spend their lives trying to learn the lesson from, say, a tragic moment of violence in their past. It is the reflection upon that brief event that constitutes the learning part of it, though, and that part extends over an indeterminate period of time. The same is true with psychedelics. The dazzling visuals and funhouse perceptions of a 15-minute DMT trip may be the subject of a lifetime of contemplation. But for others, for some people, it might be the subject of a lifetime of contemplation. But for others, they may not be. And those experiences are notoriously easy to forget, like dreams. This is a common theme. They're easy to forget. My point here is that for significant learning to take place from these experiences, it seems that some post-facto, temporally extended process of psychological integration is necessary. Otherwise, they are likely to remain submerged in one's subconsciousness, at best perhaps a vague and receding memory of a cool diversion undergone once upon a time. In terms of what has been previously discussed, in such a case, one would have gotten the epistemic loosening and the readiness to learn, but without really learning much of anything. And you got dressed up, but there was nowhere to go. I think this happens all the time, and many, if not most, of the trip reports one sees are of this ilk. Weird and wild images that are unintegrated into any larger or more durable, meaningful lesson. A sound and fury signifying very little in the end. If we want to locate the learning elements in it rather than merely catalog its passing phantasmagoria, we need to attend very carefully to the externalizations of the psychedelic experience as well as to the perceptions inside people's heads. In psychedelic lingo, this would be, again, the component of the trip setting, the external and environmental complement of the aforementioned internal and psychological set. Despite set and setting's ubiquity as a catchphrase in psychedelic guidance, there's no bright line separating the two, ultimately, any more than one could neatly separate psychological from social, individuals from society, etc. But attention to setting's temporal dimension allows for a salutary extending of analytic perspective. So this is the next element now. Accordingly, I propose an appropriately more detailed typology of setting. First are what I'll call the entheogenic envelopment. I use the term entheogenic, which is a neologism coined by classicist Carl Ruck, meaning literally defined inspired enthusiasm, because it more heavily emphasizes the religious or spiritual visionary aspects of psychedelic experiences, usually associated with organized ritual usage and often higher dosages as well. This fits very well with what I mean by envelopment, as I intend to specify specifically to stress by that word the ideational social settings that determine how these experiences are interpreted. Along with epistemic loosening, I contend that these envelopments not only shape individual psychedelic journeys, they also provide necessary conditions for learning anything from them. So, here are the types that I see. One is shamanic envelopment, or more broadly, traditional envelopment. Here, psychedelic access is mediated through some sort of teacher guide, representing an accumulation of cultural wisdom and know-how regarding the use and interpretation of relevant events. The paradigmatic figure would be the indigenous tribal shaman, who may serve variously in roles onlookers from industrial society might categorize as convener, guide, therapist, priest, doctor, teacher, doula, nutritionist, storyteller, master of ceremonies, and more, all rolled into one. Following anthropologist of religion Mircea Eliade, who himself was following Nietzsche, I would describe the situation as more or less scripted as an eternal recurrence of the same, in the sense that it is typically an age-old passed-down ceremony that recapitulates archetypal themes, much like the interminably ancient pagan elements of modern holidays that are still repeated, annually. This is, of course, a broad category, largely accessible to researchers in the annals of anthropology and history, and there are as many variations on it as there are cultural lifeways. I would note, that although there is widespread discussion of ethical issues pertaining to cultural appropriation in this area, and these problems can be very serious, especially when an indigenous group and/or other resources are threatened, the shamanic envelopment does not designate only the indigenous context. There are also archaic contexts, sometimes accessible via historical accounts. For example, the plethora of ecstatic cults in ancient Greece and Rome, and largely emanating from these persisting undercurrents within our own. For example, surviving neo-pagan traditions such as Wiccan and Druidism, with their extensive esoteric understanding of exotic plant-based potions and the like. These shamanic envelopments are by far the most important storehouses of knowledge and meaning regarding entheogens. So, next category, the medical therapeutic envelopment. This is perhaps the category most familiar to denizens of industrialized society, where, for better or worse, science and technical bureaucracies provide the reservoir of epistemic legitimacy once reserved for ecclesiastical authorities. Here, drug experiences are mediated by medical experts in the take-home form of prescriptions, for example, medical marijuana, or in a highly scripted clinical setting, as in the case of current FDA-approved psilocybin and MDMA patient trials. As psychedelics are active mostly upon the mind, the medical therapeutic envelopment is heavily weighted towards psychiatry, with a telos of healing trauma, PTSD, anxiety and depression, substance abuse, and many others. It seems like they're discovering new ones every day. And at the vaguer end of the spectrum, the many tentacles of the wellness industry and its growing set of claims for psychedelics, for example, microdosing, claims about enhancement of creativity and that kind of stuff. What is definitive of this envelopment, the medical therapeutic envelopment, is that it is conducted with the explicit goal of healing individuals with specific diagnosed conditions. Given the realities of modern medicine and its distribution, it is shaped by the institutional norms of scientific medical research, and also increasingly, especially in the US, the profit-based imperatives of the business world. Psychedelics have already become a hot investment area. Probably too late to get in on the ground floor at this point. Next envelopment is what I call the theological envelopment. This envelopment is currently much rarer than the other two, but not necessarily in the long span of history. Here there is some priestly case distributing the psychedelics under conditions prescribed by a sanctioned religious orthodoxy. It is distinguishable from shamanic envelopment by its relatively higher level of institutionalization, and by extension, at the largest scale, enjoys an established status vis-a-vis some larger political entity, state, or empire. Not always, though. It could be partaken by a dissident religious sect, such as arguably the early persecuted Christians in their catacombs and house churches, that suspicious wine at the Eucharist. In this envelopment, the purpose is to enliven some preferred religious belief system, inculcate a more robust sense of religious devotion, and to accommodate the mystical impulse toward a more personal, ecstatic experience that runs alongside every major world religion, e.v. Sufism and Islam, or Kabbalism and Judaism. The Western archetype of this envelopment is, as I mentioned it before, the Eleusinian mysteries, practiced sedulously for around 2,000 years. And despite the shroud of secrecy around it, what happens to initiates in Eleusis was to stay in Eleusis on pain of death. It was clearly massively important in the classical world and regarded as indispensable by such luminaries as Socrates, Plato, and Cicero. The ceremonies held at Eleusis itself and at the far-flung outposts of Magna Graecia seem to have included psychedelics, probably an LSD-like ergo root derivative, a scholarly conjecture that seems now to have been confirmed with physical evidence from the chalices and some of these outposts. Long since chased out of mainline Christianity, there are currently indigenous and indigenous-inspired churches, such as the Native American Church, and its long battle with the U.S. government concerning ceremonial peyote use, that represent a different kind of theological envelopment, outgrowths of the shamanic envelopment that have become larger scale and more institutionalized given the requirements of legal protection. In the U.S., this has meant advancing constitutional free exercise of religion claims to protect traditional groups' ceremonial use of psychedelic substances with assistance by statute from the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, 1993, which augments certain free exercise rights. This development was furthered by the U.S. Supreme Court in the noteworthy case of Gonzalez versus the UDV, which is where the court unanimously sided with an immigrant indigenous Amazonian church and their right to drink ayahuasca as part of their traditional religious observance. That was 2006. Again, both the Native American Church and the UDV obviously represent indigenous groups, and there are shamanic elements in their actual ceremonial use of the respective psychedelics. However, the institutionalization foisted upon them by their needs to avoid legal prosecution have placed them somewhat into the theological envelopment category. The main characteristic of the theological envelopment, however, is when the psychedelic usage is ritually scripted to advance a previously established theological narrative in a more formal, institutionalized setting. So, and then the last, there's kind of a miscellaneous envelopments. Though scattered, there are additional envelopments, other types of belief systems with their own ideas and practices involving psychedelics. There are political envelopments across the spectrum, such as the acid left, term coined by Mark Fisher, mostly an online phenomenon, which seeks to advance its particular critique of the capitalist status quo. Environmental groups that see entheogens as giving impetus to a sense of connectedness to nature pursuant to earth-friendly lifestyles and political activism, and even right-wing groups attempting to foster group cohesion and ideological devotion. There are also miscellaneous collectives, including communes and cults, sometimes heinous, like the murderous Manson family, who have provided psychedelic envelopment pursuant to their own idiosyncratic ends. There are also more benign cultish communities like the Deadheads, who created an itinerant communal subculture of Grateful Dead camp followers. Under this catch-all category is perhaps the most widespread envelopment of all, or maybe it represents an absence of envelopment, which is commonly labeled informal or recreational use. This is where individuals or ad hoc microgroups of friends and acquaintances partake of psychedelics for amusement, out of curiosity, or maybe for a DIY personal development, with or without a trip sitter for safety. And their experience plays out indeterminately according to their variegated sets and settings. Derivative as it is from larger cultural assumptions about leisure time, and also largely relegated to the private sphere due to the currently illegal status of most psychedelics, except in Oregon, under certain conditions now. The recreational use envelopment tends to be ideologically framed by a default libertarian and/or consumerist ethos, where what a freely choosing subject personally gains from the experience is paramount. It is about individual insight and/or enjoyment. Most who have experimented with psychedelics have taken them under the aspect of this envelopment. There's also a growing psychedelics tourism industry, for example, mushrooms in Jamaica, ayahuasca in Peru, that provide a niche example of this type of use. Since they are using powerful psychedelics, participants in these tourist conclaves often report very meaningful experiences. But even where an authentic shaman is present, these are not going to be full shamanic envelopments, not because there's anything inherently ethically wrong with them, cultural appropriation considerations aside, but because the participants are not doxastically ensconced within the officiant shaman's cultural imaginary. So it should be noted that there are not bright lines among these categories. The shamanic envelopment obviously often has medical therapeutic elements. Within those cultures, the relevant plants are commonly revered as plant medicines, and individuals in indigenous communities will sometimes, actually very commonly, seek these rituals to heal personal traumas. Similarly, the wellness approach that often blends with a quasi-religious envelopment when it incorporates religious elements from whatever tradition, from New Age sensibilities to Eastern-inspired meditation and breathing techniques. There are and have been and will continue to be countless fusions and blends. The envelopment categories are blunt instruments and do not provide surgical delineations, but I think they can help us begin to map the different ways in which the context of entheogenic usage can fix lasting meanings into experiencer's mind. So that's one of my categories for identifying the learning experience. A central axiom of the philosophical school known as phenomenology, founded by Edmund Husserl, is that all consciousness is consciousness of something in particular. When we hear, see, or touch something, we always are hearing, seeing, or touching some X. There is never pure, unadulterated hearing, seeing, or touching in and of themselves. We never just have a thought, either. One that is just a thought, simpliciter. When thinking, we are always thinking about something or other. For Husserl, consciousness therefore always has intentionality in this orientational sense. Even a more general sensation like pain is felt as locatable somewhere in the body, even inaccurate phantom limb pain. It is the same with tripping on psychedelics. One never just trips. There is always something or some things in particular going on within the temporal flow of the tripping, even if all of one's perceptions, including that very temporal flow, seem distorted beyond anything familiar. For example, 15-minute DMT trips that seem like they go on for hours or days. The phenomenological point is that since there is perceiving going on, however bizarre, one is always perceiving X, Y, and Z. Even where the psychoactivity has upturned the epistemic apple cart, for example, in cases of synesthesia, hearing colors, seeing sounds, people record that a lot. One is never just perceiving per se. Our brains are wired to focus on this and that by perpetually distinguishing figure from ground, without which we would suffer catatonia from the constant riot of incoming sensation. And those focused upon thises and that's always inevitably marshal forth our interpretive faculties. We can't help but make sense of our perceptions as about something or other. As is true of experience generally, both set and setting collaborate hermeneutically and fuse themselves with one another, and we can't help it. It isn't possible for us to refrain from interpreting what happens to us. In terms of psychedelics, there is an initial epistemic loosening, sometimes quite destabilizing, that has the effect of causing us, perhaps for the first time in our lives, not to fully trust our perceptual apparatus. We have the unsettling lived experience of Descartes vis-a-vis his famous demon, who in the Meditations arrives as a thought experiment to dramatize that we could be deceived about everything, and so must embrace hyperbolic doubt concerning all of our senses in order to then figure out what to trust. With psychedelics, even at lower doses, we are led to entertain not just the fleeting intellectual fancy that our senses could in principle be wrong, but we are made to suffer the actual experience that they are in fact not as reliable or comprehensive as we had thought. This lived dissonance can provoke strong emotions. Mild psychedelic trips usually begin and end in this realm where perception gets a bit weird and nothing much else happens. Depending on the substance and the dosage, however, some push further into a categorically different realm of true hallucinations and other extreme oddities. For example, a sufficient dose of DMT seems almost guaranteed to accomplish this. People with DMT call this breaking through. There's a place you stop And you sometimes don't go further, but sometimes you break through. Anyway, at whatever intensity it occurs, though, epistemic loosening in principle provides a prerequisite for becoming ready to learn in the classic Socratic sense. In terms of any durable learning and beyond personal idiosyncrasies having to do with an individual's mindset, what happens next, in my view, depends on the controlling psychedelic envelopment. If it is to occur, this is where lasting meaning is made. For this is where most psychedelic experiences seem to fall short, especially within the envelopment of recreational use. They often begin and end at mere entertainment. Plenty of weirdness and fragmentary visions and fluid plot lines, much like an especially colorful, crazy dream, but nothing much of enduring significance. To be sure, this is an interesting area to research. For example, what is going on optically with the reported visual acuity with psilocybin, for example, including allegedly heightened peripheral vision and so on. There are people researching that too. What we are trying to locate here, however, are durable learning experiences, the type where, as Christopher Timmerman and colleagues report in their recent study, Psychedelics Alter Metaphysical Beliefs, this is a 2021 study, psychedelic users in an ersatz ceremonial context were, quote, inclined to change their, quote, metaphysical beliefs. That is, their basic assumptions about the nature of reality, and that the observed changes were enduring, persisting for up to 6 months in most domains. These deep alterations, I think, are enacted as the tripping experience is filtered through the governing envelopment. It is a matter for further empirical investigation, but I would predict these alterations to be largely context dependent, and that's kind of a debate that's going on. The initial epistemic destabilization is like a preliminary warm-up in this regard. It creates an openness to an interpretive integration, a fluid, putty-like state that is especially susceptible to a hermeneutic fusion of set and setting that might proceed in any number of directions. I do not think there is any warrant for the view that there is an inherent context-independent direction to psychedelic experience. That there is such a direction is commonly implied by in the folklore of psychedelia, and it seems to function as conventional wisdom among enthusiasts. And this includes some of the spookier claims about DMT, if you've ever followed any of this. For example, encounters many claim to have had with trickster-like entities, sometimes identified as what Terence McKenna called machine elves, sometimes clockwork elves. One hears of how psychedelics promote a feeling of connectedness and a sense of harmony with nature and so on. The unit of experience where at varying levels of explicitness a quasi-Gaian worldview is embraced. It seems to me, however, that this is more likely a projection from a set of previously held convictions, perhaps not altogether consciously on the part of the subject herself. Those of us already prone to a nature-centered environmentalist outlook will, in a sense, see what we want to see and see what we are interpreting we'll see what we want to see when we're interpreting what we've undergone. In the clinical setting, where the envelopment has been therapeutic and focused on overcoming past trauma, literally sessions with the therapist before and after the prescribed trip, this is like the Johns Hopkins, what they do there mostly. It is proportionally likely that any lessons taken will center on the trauma and what has been the collaborative focus of therapist and patient. And the shamanic envelopment is unsurprising when the entheogenic visions, in terms relatable to the particular cultural imaginary of the trip setting, when they relate to that. And it should not be surprising in the least that within a theological envelopment, like Walter Pankey's famous Good Friday experiment with psilocybin held at Boston University's Marsh Chapel in 1962, the graduate student participants drawn from Harvard's Divinity School had mystical religious experiences, including one who had to be sedated because he's fled the chapel due to his ecstatic visions of the Messiah. None of these Christian theology students saw Baal or Dionysus or UFOs or the Mayan god Itzamna. Predictably, they saw Jesus. That their ecstatic visions came robed in their pre-existing theology seems hardly coincidental. A fuller empirical analysis comparing psychedelic experiences across the different envelopments awaits. Maybe that's what I'll work on more. But an aggregation of the various studies and the copious anecdotal reportage suggests a kind of psychedelic polymorphy. What one learns from the experience is less a function of a drug's internal pharmacological properties than it is of the revelatory contours of the governing envelopment and how that envelopment shapes that trip into something meaningful for an actual individual's life. In other words, the quality of the experience is not just an internal fusion of the drug per se, an internal function of the drug per se, but also, and perhaps more importantly, an external function of the specific envelopment. In this sense, psychedelics might be more accurately thought of as quantitative accelerators in the service of whatever combustible worldview elements are ready to hand from the synthesis of participant and envelopment. Depending on these internal and external factors, some have more to burn, some less. Okay, so this indicates a fourth major factor in locating, this is the last big one that I'll talk about. This indicates the fourth factor in locating the learning element within entheogenic experiences, what I'll call doxastic enhancement. I use the term doxastic in order to specify that it is an individual's extant belief structure or worldview supported by whatever sociocultural and material factors that seems to be the main determining factor when describing durable meanings, real learning, ascribing those to these experiences. Otherwise, we are back to the mere cataloging of a string of disconnected perceptions, the endless trip reports made up of all the cool things so-and-so saw when he did this and that. My suggestion is that psychedelics can serve to enhance and enliven an individual's pre-existing belief structures, like pouring fuel on a smoldering fire. They function as a worldview accelerant. They do not provide the beliefs de novo so much as they can animate them, paradoxically via an initial loosening of perception. I would speculate that in the best case, they do not harden pre-existing beliefs so much as they extend those beliefs roughly in the directions they are already oriented toward by a particular environment. They kind of grow them outward. One might speculate that the sensation of novelty with the psychedelic experience has much to do with a rejuvenating pulse that it sends through one's existing network of belief, like illuminating a dense mesh of Christmas lights, that simultaneously grow new connections both to itself in recombinant loops and also into new territory, facets of what brain science terms neuroplasticity. Continuing in neurological terms, psychedelics may help us to foster a certain goal-directed plasticity of mind, a creative and educational sweet spot where we are rendered highly receptive to absorbing larger archetypal patterns to which our cultural and religious traditions provide us only partial access. One might think of this as a kind of Vygotskian zone of psychedelic proximal development, where if we are close enough already, an entheogen could bootstrap us into learning something worthwhile. Neither plasticity nor goal-orientedness alone is a proper goal for learning. An excess of the former would result in an unproductive mental spasticity, while an excess of the latter can deteriorate into an equally unproductive rut of unreflective rule following. Goal-directed plasticity represents having a general trajectory, in this case a general worldview, however acquired, but also being able to maintain maneuverability within that trajectory. One might be seeking answers to particular questions within a particular cultural frame, but also open to alterations of those very questions. I'm reminded of Nietzsche's aphorism about the composer Georg Friedrich Handel's peculiar genius as, quote, freedom under the law. A good way to word this Goldilocks situation, where creativity does not go off the rails because it is simultaneously tempered by fealty to a tradition. In this sense, it might not be too much to describe psychedelics as capable of catalyzing a kind of neo-animism, where via doxastic enhancement, we may find assistance in learning to re-enchant our world, a world that has, for too many in the contemporary world, grown cold and void of lasting meaning. So just a little summary here of all this, including my little new neologisms here. In summary, in this paper I've tried to make sense of widespread reports that psychedelic experiences are not merely entertaining, but that people feel they have learned something important from them. The problem is that it appears to be difficult to communicate just exactly what these alleged important things are. Approaching the psychedelic experience as an educational process yields what I hope are helpful categories for identifying what is durably worthwhile in those experiences. These can be listed as: 1, an epidemic loosening, a Socratic dishevelment of unexamined assumptions that renders one ready to learn. 2, pursuant to a tendency toward hypertrophic identification, where the subject is impelled toward an identification with some larger entity and more durable than the melting, some entity that's larger and more durable than the melting ego. 3, all of which unfolds under the aspect of a particular entheogenic envelopment, reflecting the range of sociocultural and ideational belief frameworks of belief where the entheogens are actually administered. 4, leading in the best case to a doxastic enhancement where the participant's existing belief framework is enlivened and extended. I contend that it is a mistake to view psychedelics as containing any determinate message or specific teaching, despite the conventional wisdom that they inherently usher us toward a unitive feeling of connectedness with nature and the like. To be clear, I don't dispute the Gaia-like sentiment, only that such a telos is an inherent property of the substances. Rather, I think the moment of ego dissolution is associated with epistemic loosening puts us in a state of mind tending toward hypertrophic identification. Immediately with ego dissolution comes a reconstitutive push that seeks to cure the self-oblivion via a mimetic fusion with some larger and or more meaningful entity, for example, imitation of Christ. This is potentially a moment of extreme vulnerability, where we are, as Robin Carhart Harris of Imperial College London has shown, we are, quote, suggestible and disposed to want to latch onto whatever set of stable seeming meanings is closest to hand. And as I've noted, there are clear dangers here of an unscrupulous person, some cultish or Manson type, constructing an envelopment designed to take advantage of this temporary disequilibrium. Mostly these larger meanings are available as they are refracted through the entheogenic envelopment and by the wider worldview or fragments thereof that we bring to the experience via our own background and heritage. So it is not only one's individual psychological profile and frame of mind, including any serious trauma, that makes meaning out of the experience, but a fusion of that profile with one's wider cultural horizons, however much one is explicitly aware of those horizons. In the manner of Jungian archetypes, one way to look at it, these horizons can be iceberg-like in that the part of it of which we are aware is just the tip. As the psychoanalyst would counsel, becoming more explicitly aware of one's deep motivational pattern is no small thing. So the tip of the spear of the learning process, then, lies in the doxastic enhancement phase, where reconnections are formed between self and at least some subset of its heretofore obscured motivating beliefs, initiating a process of reacquaintance with something like archetypal patterns of meaning. This is a point at which some people find God, Spinoza's God, or nature. However grand this process sounds, though, it also implies that entheogens, however powerful as catalysts or accelerants, are not a substitute for, quote, normal learning experiences where one expands one's understanding of one's world, ex hypothesi, for the maximum entheogenic effect. The more appropriated mental material there is lying around to work with, the better. One must still do one's homework. The richer an understanding of one's own motivating worldview one has acquired, the more durably significant the learning experiences based off of that understanding are likely to be. Sorry to say, but psychedelics are no excuse for intellectual laziness. On the contrary, they may efficiently jumpstart one's awareness, but apart from that, they are not really a shortcut. So, stay in school, kids. Last statement here. Given the hermeneutical structure of the learning experience, that is, as a fusion of personal and cultural horizons, the maxim garbage in and garbage out is likely still to obtain. Superficial people who are uninterested in the world around them will have superficial and uninteresting trips. And I say this with full humility, recognizing that depth of understanding is not at all to be equated with academic knowledge. Credentialed snobbery in this area is a sure sign of foolishness. A durable learning experience grounded in the sense that something deep and meaningful has occurred, even if one can't quite put one's finger on it, consists in this reconnection, and perhaps even in the mere attempt at reconnecting. For who can say when such a process is complete? Does this level of profound learning occur in every psychedelic trip? No, certainly not. but every one of them gestures toward it. Ultimately, I would suggest that psychedelics do not so much give us insight as they may allow insight to occur. They may help us reach for meaning, but they themselves do not provide it. All right, so...
Thanks, David. Sorry, I had to turn off one of my devices so I didn't get the echo. But yeah, thanks very much. I just wanted to say that we have about 10 minutes, I think, for questions. We started late, but I put in the chat, if people have questions, they can either raise their hand in the Zoom, sort of fashion, or turn on your camera to indicate you'd like to ask a question, or post something in the chat. And then for the people in the room, of course, just raise your hand and ask away.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Let's give you a little background. I spent my 20s in the 1960s when hallucinogenics were a standard part of everyday conversation. So this is kind of also almost a nostalgic trip. And I should also say that most of my career has been concerned with addressing what Virginia Woolf called the cotton wool of everyday life, and how we, after our individual fashions, go about removing that cotton wool. And I think that psychedelics are one possible avenue, which I have to admit, explored very lightly in the 60s, but I had friends who were much more deeply involved. I think people like Timothy Leary actually gave it a bad press because he overused it.
Yeah, for sure.
But in terms of that cotton wool, there are moments, and what the psychedelics do is actually they last a little bit too long. For genuine aesthetic experiences, they're very brief duration. But it's part of that shortness, brief duration, that I think provides the value, because they are personally significant moments. And we treasure these, no matter what the occasion is. I mean, it's that I think that you refer to as people having a difficult time expressing what it was they learned. That is perhaps where the arts come in. We play with poetry, we paint, and so on and so forth, because we have a limited vocabulary. So that, in a nutshell, is the kind of things that I've been concerned with over time. Pursuing that heightened awareness, I guess, is the easiest way of addressing it. However we arrive there. I think psychedelics are certainly not the only avenue. Anything that scares the daylights out of you for a moment also heightens your awareness. I remember being on an airplane once where it's just 20 minutes before we were supposed to land, just did a nosedive till we were just barely above the huts that we were about to crash into when it leveled out. The captain never said a word about it. Just one of those things. But we sort of paid attention. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, and it's all about, I mean, I think it's, yeah, you're right. And that's why I called some attention to, the issue of temporality and the duration, the short duration. And that's elastic to some extent too. These, like DMT, these trips are short in terms of an external observer clocking them at 10 or 15 minutes, but are reported to seem as if they may last hours, even days, an indefinite amount of time. And so, it's, what the psychologists would call it is integration, right? How these experiences are integrated, in terms of how one sort of integrates it with one's sort of psyche, one's personality, how it integrates in one's life. Does this process of integration occur always, no matter what? If you don't grab it consciously and do it in an explicit manner, in a deliberate manner, is it going on subconsciously at some level? Perhaps it is. Set and setting. I want to draw attention to setting, and I think those. It's almost as if those first hours, I think, are very crucial. That kind of set a pattern. That's what I use the metaphor of molds. Like it's lava. The experience is kind of this hot lava that's poured into molds, and so looking at what those molds are. Because once they're poured into molds, it cools off, and the meaning, I think, often is set. It's very hard to sort of change it afterwards and in the longer term. So I think that moment where there's the loosening and the destabilizing and even the ego dissolution and so on, the moments right after that, I think, are really, really crucial. But it does extend, I think the reflection and learning process can extend, even though that's crucial at the beginning, I think it can extend out an indefinite period of time, a lifetime. He mentioned having nostalgic, maybe a nostalgic reminiscence of these trips can be educative in their own way sometimes too, even in surprising places. So for example, I mentioned the paintings of Alex Gray. You might want to Google Alex Gray if you want, and you can see his paintings of the kind of hallucinogenic, sort of inspired paintings. And one thing I was made to appreciate only kind of recently is that I kind of had, I guess I was in a kind of, representational art mindset where I was thinking, he's trying to show what goes on in trips. And I mean, there's some of that maybe, but I've come to understand that many, many people value that artwork, and in fact having it up in their homes and their living spaces, because it actually, talk about nostalgia, it actually sort of serves as a reminder of what was learned, during a psychedelic experience. Like you have those up, you kind of walk back, I need to remember this, And people often strongly report that like, I need to remember, and not just psychedelics, we can see this in other significant events of life, like, I need to remember this, note to self, I need to remember what I learned here, and it's so easy to forget, and sort of battling this forgetfulness. Time, it slips away, So I want to draw attention to. I think that's where educators, broadly understood, can have a lot to say. In terms of interpreting, extending meanings from these experiences. But again, I think we're always encased in these envelopments and within our culture and our different layers of narrative that we're in that we can't. And I want in this paper to kind of combat what I see as a tendency to, combat sounds kind of harsh, but I guess I'll say that, to just kind of like think that, the drugs will do the work. You just kind of sit back, because there is this sense you have to be passive to experience it, and it's probably true, you'll have, more likely to have a bad trip if you try to fight it, and so on and so forth. That's almost common sense, conventional wisdom at this point. But at the same time, this idea of, just the drugs by themselves are self-interpreting, and they'll just kind of give you the meanings. I don't think that's a productive way to think about it. So anyway, let me see, there's maybe some questions, relieved by the conclusions. Somebody's saying we should mute the microphones?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, you did that. Okay, great. All right, sorry. You already did that. All right, we're good. All right, anybody? Question?
Well, there is one comment in the chat that I'm just going to give the person an opportunity if they want to expand on it. It says, enjoyed the talk and relieved by the conclusions.
Hey, Zubaida, that's Zubaida. That's a colleague of mine.
I think, Zubaida, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, maybe wants to jump in. Please do.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Yeah, that's on mute, but I can unmute.
Oh, wait, hold on. I just need to unmute you on this end.
Okay.
Okay, you're good.
Hi,
Hi.
thanks. So I enjoyed the talk. I appreciated the motive that you just mentioned because it's an important one. But I don't read as much the literature that you read a lot, and I was intrigued by the concept of epistemic loosening. Is that a common expression in your work?
No, it's debuting right here. So,
I love it. I love it. I
yeah.
find a lot of good uses in my work on nature of science and how we want to loosen people's epistemic views towards the world. I really like it a lot. And
Oh, thanks.
I think it has promise of generating new avenues for how we think about things.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. So, yeah, and I thought the parallels with the Socratic, achievement of ignorance, and the Meno and elsewhere were kind of interesting parallels. And I chose looseness because it's a spectrum. Loosening, it's a spectrum. It can be mild, it can be more extreme. But I guess I see it as a way of, a way of addressing an important precondition of learning,
It's an educational goal, actually. Like, I would put it as like an educational goal, a very valid one to consider.
Yeah,
Thank
although
you. Inspired you thinking.
Yeah, I guess in some ways, though, I suppose it's probably not. It's not a goal in and of itself, though. In some ways, right? Because if you only achieve, maybe it's a bit. Maybe you could argue Socrates never achieved more than that. If you teach Socratic dialogues like I do a lot, usually the finale, the grand finale of the Socratic dialogue is, well, we don't know, but at least we know we don't know, and that's an achievement. It's pretty good. Been a pretty long run for those Platonic dialogues.
It creates an openness, a framework of open-mindedness that enables people to consider other points of view.
Yeah, the plasticity. So, but then I think what happens next though is what's fascinating to me. What about that openness, and then what is done with that openness? And I think it's not all peace, love, and understanding. And Gaia, I think it's often can be very nefarious and has been in history in various ways and bears those possibilities as well. So, yeah, so I don't know, do you see that too? Is like potentially, within a learning context of curriculum and so on, it seems like almost harmless or just kind of pleasant and a nice thing, but I think it has a dark side too that has to be acknowledged.
I don't know. I believe in epistemic pluralism.
Right.
When we talk about nature of science, when explanatory pluralism. So I think it feeds into this kind of orientation to looking at ideas and looking at complementary ways of viewing the world. Maybe sometimes also contradictory, but it enables the dialogue. That would not otherwise be possible to achieve.
Yeah.
I don't want to take
agree.
more time because I can always discuss this with you.
Yeah, that's true. Like we could do that. Zubayda's from Delaware, so she's from my school. Yeah. Well, thanks for your question. Anybody else wanna? Yeah.
I think we may.
Oh, whoops. Hold. Thank you.
Yeah, we're working with a, I guess a somewhat, slapdash broadcasting system here, but I think we actually probably should call things to an end unless there's like one more quick question, but Patricia? Yeah, I'll give you the last word and then we'll sign off.
Yeah, okay, well, I just wanted to pick up on your point about the negative aspects of psychedelics that you're talking about here, because I didn't hear very much of that, and I'm just thinking about, in very, miserable situations in poverty-stricken places where, drugs, serious drugs like heroin and everything else. But psychedelics are a part of this also, that, it's all a big part of, like you say, this numbing and narcotic and escaping the miseries of life. And so, there is this very serious side where adolescents, where children, young people are taking these narcotics to escape this miserable life, and they're in their high moments, they're doing crazy things, they're killing themselves, they're jumping off bridges, etc. So there's all this kind of big negative area that I'm hearing all the great advertisement for the great side of it, but there's also this very dark side that is kind of underneath all of this here, that I think when you talk about educational value, it becomes very dangerous, and there's you're influencing a lot of young people who are perhaps in really desperate situations to think about that. So it's just the other side of the argument. I'd like to perhaps press on a little bit more there.
Yeah, well, I guess I recognize that. I just taught, this semester I was teaching a seminar to my legal studies students. And one of the books we read is by Carl Hart, who is the former chair of psychology at Columbia. And he has this book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups, which I don't think you'd like very much in a lot of ways. But well, I shouldn't say that, no prejudge it, but I mean, he makes a very strong argument, he has several strong arguments, but one argument he makes is that sort of blaming drugs, and we're talking primarily here, the instances that you're referencing, opioids, methamphetamine, cocaine derivatives, a bit more somatic, drugs, which I think are associated with the more catastrophic consequences than mushrooms or and so on. But Carl Hart argues very forcefully that this sort of blaming the drugs is almost a way to camouflage systemic injustices. Is it any big surprise that opioid addiction is as prevalent in areas that are desperately poor and that are sort of living in the ashes of post-industrial, life. Same with meth, and all of that. Now, one thing that Hart also does, which I think is really, really interesting and challenging, he challenges the psychedelic community. And he identifies what he sees as kind of almost a psychedelic elitism, like a psychedelic snobbery, that goes on, where they're psychedelic users making claims, these sort of spiritual claims, like, oh, this is the high-minded drug that you do for spiritual development and so on. It's very much not to be confused with those bad drugs that the sort of bad people do, the opioids and meth and PCP even, and so on and so forth. Even though chemically a lot of these drugs are the sort of the same things that people are taking. So it gets to be, it's a very tangled discussion, very fraught, in a lot of ways. But I mean, at the same time, I guess I just recognize, my overall argument is that the results, the outcomes, what's of educational value in these experiences is context dependent. It's not just a free pass to positivity. So I definitely hear, I think, the concern, the larger concern that you're coming from. So.
Well, maybe we can end on this point of thinking about psychedelic exceptionalism, right?
Yes.
I'll just thanks a lot, David, for an interesting talk.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks to the people in the room and to those who joined us online, and hope it was doxastically enhancing.
Yeah, that's good. Perfect.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. So.